Welcome to the Media Storm studio. Our first guest is the co-director of Level Up, the feminist community campaigning for gender justice in the UK. She is a writer, media strategist and campaigner on a mission to end imprisonment of pregnant women and mothers. Welcome to the studio once again, Janie Starling.
Hi, hello.
And our second guest is a co-founder of Level Up's No Pregnancy in Prison campaign. She has lived experience of the issue as she was first sent to prison when 6 months pregnant and gave birth whilst held on remand. She's using a pseudonym to protect her privacy, and we're so thankful to her for joining us to share her experience and expertise. Welcome to the studio, Anna.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Okay, let's begin. So to start, Janie, can you just explain the issue that we're here to discuss and tell us how and why the Level Up campaign started?
So prison will never be a safe place to be pregnant. We know that pregnant women in prison are 7 times more likely to suffer a stillbirth, twice as likely to give birth prematurely, and tragically 3 babies have died in the last 5 years inside the women's prison estate. Now, the campaign started 6 years ago now, after the deaths of 2 babies inside women's prisons. One was the death of baby Aisha Cleary at HMP Bronzefield in 2019, where her mother, Rihanna Cleary, was left to give birth inside her cell at night. Her calls for help on the buzzer system had been ignored, and she was left to bite through her baby's umbilical cord.
Oh my God.
Her baby died. A matter of months later, Louise Powell, in HMP Style in Cheshire, went into labour prematurely on a prison toilet. Again, her calls for help went unheard, and her baby was born breech, which meant its feet came out first. Breech babies it's a high-risk birth. They need to be managed really, really carefully. She didn't get the medical care that she needed. She was in agony for hours. And again, by the time paramedics arrived, it was too late to resuscitate her baby. Now, the deaths of these 2 babies were shocking in their own right. But what was more shocking was that the only thing the government had to offer in response was to, quote unquote, improve healthcare for women in prison. And it just seemed really clear that if the case wasn't obvious enough that prison by very design will never be a safe place to be pregnant, and any healthcare improvements that are written on paper just simply don't happen in practice, if that was ever going to be obvious, it was going to be when 2 babies had died. So Level Up started about launching a campaign to shift the needle away from this healthcare reform inside prison to just keeping pregnant women out. And the launch of the campaign was in 2021, after the prison ombudsman actually did a report into the death of the first baby and ruled that every pregnancy in prison is categorised as high risk by virtue of the fact a woman is held behind locked doors for significant periods of time. Now, in that statement is an admission that the very design of a prison will never be safe. And what it meant was, if every pregnancy in prison is high risk, when a court sentences a woman to prison, they sentence her to a high-risk pregnancy. Now, we just think that's completely untenable. And so since 2021, we have been fighting for pregnant women to be kept out of prison.
That says it really well. If you sentence a pregnant woman to prison, you sentence her to a high-risk pregnancy. Just for context, can you outline how does the UK's policy on pregnancy in prison compare to other countries? Is this done elsewhere the same way?
So there are several countries that have laws that severely curtail the use of imprisonment for pregnant women. Costa Rica, for example, uses home detention curfew and house arrest. Brazil has a practice. There's a Supreme Court ruling that says that pregnant women and mothers of children, I think up to 8 years old, can't be held in prison before their trial, so on remand or in pre-trial detention. So there's much better practice in other areas of the world, and actually England is behind.
Anna, I wonder if you can tell us a bit about your story. So you were pregnant when you were first sent to prison.
Yep. Can
Can you describe that feeling and tell us a bit more about those experiences?
It was a bit of a surprise. Obviously, it's the first time I'd ever been arrested. First time I'd ever been involved with the criminal justice system. I was 6 months pregnant. I was arrested, taken to the police station, From there, I was charged, told that I was going to court the next day. Went to court the next day. Wasn't even mentioned in court that I was pregnant, even though I was visibly pregnant. I was 6 months pregnant. I just had a temporary solicitor, a duty solicitor. He didn't even mention in that I was pregnant, or even try and fight for bail. It was very poor. So yeah, got remanded into custody. Went into custody. I was given the option to either go into a cell by myself, a single cell, because I was pregnant, or I could be padded up with somebody. I chose to go with my co-defendant because ultimately I knew I was going to end up going into labour whilst I was in prison. So I thought that was the safest option, because obviously, as you can imagine, you're behind a locked door and you've got no support. So yeah, went in, stayed there for the 3 months until I went into labour and had my son.
How was your labour experience?
That was a whole nother story. So obviously it was my first son, so I didn't really know what was going to happen. My co-defendant had a child, so we spoke about stuff, and she said she was going to be ready with towels, because obviously it's a labour, it's unpredictable. You don't know how fast or slow it's going to be. Started getting some pains in my back early hours of the morning. Got up, started pacing up and down the cell. Was a bit like, obviously it's a very confined area as well. Pacing up and down, I was like, okay, I'm pretty sure something's happening. Got to about 5:30 in the morning, pressed the cell bell, told them I think I might be starting labour. That was ignored. They said somebody would be with me soon. They didn't. Between the hours of 5:30 and 7:30, the cell bell was pressed 4 times. At 7:30, my door was unlocked by the officers that had changed over from the night staff. And when I said to that officer, oh, I'm pretty sure I'm in labour, or my labour's starting, she looked very shocked. She pulled me out the cell, put me in a communal area, and told me I had to wait for a midwife to come and confirm that I was in labour. I then had to wait for the midwife to come. Not the midwife, sorry, the prison nurse. I had to wait for her to come. It was the morning, she was doing mid rounds, she was busy and stuff. So she came, took my blood pressure, which still to this day absolutely baffles me as to how that indicates I'm in labour. This time I'm visibly in pain and I'm very uncomfortable. She said, yeah, she's in labour, I need to get her out to the hospital. I then had to further wait for the prison to find 2 staff to escort me, and they'd called an ambulance. I then had to wait for the ambulance to be security cleared to come into the prison for me to then go into the back of it before it could leave. Got into the back of the ambulance. Sorry, before I even got into the back of the ambulance, I'd been told previously by a governor that I wouldn't be handcuffed when I was in labour. There was one female officer. She then cuffed me to her. And when I said this to her and I questioned it, and I said, I've been told previously I wouldn't be cuffed when I'm in labour. She told me, be grateful she's put me on long cuffs and not short cuffs. So there was a chain between the cuffs rather than wrist to wrist. So she kind of set the tone for how I knew her attitude was going to be, and it just made it very uncomfortable. So yeah, got to the hospital. Eventually, yeah, luckily made it to the hospital and had my son.
I actually feel so disturbed hearing that. I personally can't believe that we would hold a woman in prison without any sort of buffer around up until the point that she's in labour and pressing a buzzer repeatedly. Sorry, I have never heard this story, or this, that this happens before. Yeah. So you're getting my immediate reaction. I
also think that, I mean, I don't have a child. I've never been pregnant, but part of the reason for that is because of how scary it is. Mm-hmm. And I think it's scary for anybody who is pregnant generally, and giving birth in itself is so scary. Yeah. Let alone doing it in prison, or having to go through that, having to be handcuffed, having to wait. A lot of those experiences you just described was a lot of waiting and waiting around for stuff.
It is literally, when you go into that situation, yours and your unborn baby's fate is in somebody else's hands. You have no control over it. Like, once you're in that position and you're in that prison environment, there's physically nothing you can do. Like, and I've had another child now on the outside, so I can compare the two situations, and it's like, I had missed hospital appointments. I had a situation where I had reduced fetal movements. They didn't get me out to the hospital till the next day. So, and it's like, that's an emergency situation. Anybody else in the community would take themselves to the hospital and get themselves checked out. But when you're there, your hands are literally tied. Like I said, your fate is literally in somebody else's hands.
And it's not just your labour, right? During pregnancy, there's all this focus on nutrition and getting the right diet.
Yeah.
I guess you also have no control over your diet in prison. Would you get special consideration for being pregnant? Would you get different food to other people?
No, the policy is that you're meant to get extra, and if you're hungry, you're meant to be accommodated for. Doesn't happen. That's the long and short of it. That's the reason why I took part in this campaign, because it's so much of, they'll say, oh, well, this is what's in the policy, but it's not happening. Policy and procedure are very far apart. So
and we know that about prison.
Yeah. And it I think people expect, when you go into prison and you're pregnant, that you're cared for, and people think, oh, surely they're not going to put a prison woman into that environment and not take care of her properly because of the risks. But the actual true story of it is, it's no different. Your healthcare's worse, your nutrition's worse. You're worse off in that situation because you literally have no responsibility over your own care.
Mm. And did I get this right, that you were on remand at the time, which means you hadn't actually been tried and criminally convicted? You were awaiting trial.
Yeah.
And I asked this because I read Observer data from the Observer, which said 1 in 3 pregnant women in prison are on remand.
Yep.
Was that just like salt in the wound?
It's very common for it. Like when you go into that, obviously I'd never been in that environment. So when I went into prison and I'm seeing all these women, the amount of women that were in there on remand was shocking to me.
After you gave birth, you were granted bail for 3 months until your trial.
Yep.
And then once you were sentenced, you were returned to prison and you were separated from your baby. Now, I'm sure any parents listening can't even imagine being separated from their child.
Yep.
How long was that for? And, can you begin to describe that feeling? And when were you reunited?
So court kept getting adjourned because there was other people they couldn't bring from prisons or whatever. And then, so as you can imagine, every time I was saying goodbye to my son, didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know how long I was going to be away for. I kind of knew I would be going to prison, but I just didn't know how long for. So I didn't know if I would be able to have him back with me on an MBU, if I was leaving him for good. So that was emotional. I had to do that 3 times and say goodbye to him. Got sentenced, went back into the prison I had left that had the mother and baby unit. So I kind of knew who I needed to speak to. So when I set foot in reception, I said, I need to speak to the lady from the mother and baby unit. I was bugging absolutely everybody. And eventually 5 weeks later, I sat at mother and baby board, and I did end up getting accepted to go back onto that mother and baby unit at that prison. But it's just like no one rushes to do anything, and I'm just like, okay, I've got my son on the outside and I don't think anyone's really understanding this. So he was coming on visits because my mum was taking care of him at the time, and I said to my mum, I'm gonna have to stop bringing him, because I was crying, he was crying, because by that time obviously we had a bond, he knew who I was. And I said, it's upsetting everybody, like until I know what's going on, we're just going to have to stop the visits. So I did that, but then luckily a couple of weeks later, I got the board and was able to have him back.
Okay. Now, Level Up, for a long time, was campaigning for changes in sentencing guidelines, right? I think right now we need a positive moment. So you've had some success in that area, right? Can you tell us about that success?
Yeah, we have. So we this campaign has like a long-term strategy, and obviously, as you've heard, a lot of people think, oh, prison, you go there because you've been convicted and sentenced and that's who's in prison. But actually, people don't realise that there is a significant number of women who are in prison before their trial. But we knew that we had to tackle sentencing and the use of remand, but we had to do sentencing first. So we targeted the Sentencing Council, who are a group of expert judges and some academics who oversee the sentencing guidelines that are used in all courts across England and Wales. And we were shocked when we looked into it. So this was when we were doing research in around 2019 to 2020, after the babies had died in prisons. But before we launched the campaign, we did significant research with, expert midwives like Dr. Laura Abbott. And we were looking at the processes in courts, and we couldn't see anywhere that there was any guide for judges to even consider a pregnancy when they were making decisions on whether to send a woman to custody. Now, that's absolutely appalling. So we thought, well, the first thing we have to do is make sure that courts are considering this and they recognise that it's a high-risk environment for a pregnant woman. So we launched an open letter to the Sentencing Council in 2022, basically calling for a new sentencing framework for pregnant women and mothers, because by that point it had been 3 years since the first baby had died and there had been absolutely no change to the system, which was shocking. And it felt like there was this huge cultural moment of outrage and shock that pregnant women were in prison, but then no material change delivered off the back of it. So we knew we had to hold on to that moment and keep the momentum. So we had this letter, and it was signed by, the Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, British Association for Perinatal Medicine. It was very, very clear. There was just broad consensus across all healthcare and maternity experts that it was simply unsafe, and we needed a new sentencing framework to take that into consideration. So years on, in the intervening last 3 years, the Sentencing Council have listened. They've run 2 consultations on new sentencing measures for pregnant women. So one was a new mitigating factor for pregnancy, which meant that courts, when they're deciding a sentence, had to consider pregnancy as something that could reduce or change the nature of the sentence.
You say that again. That could reduce or change the nature of the sentence.
So a mitigating factor is something that could reduce or change the nature of the sentence. And then more recently, they announced much more wide-ranging measures in their new imposition of custodial and community sentences guideline, which essentially now says all pregnancies in prison are high risk and courts must avoid the use of custody for pregnant women, which is massive. It's like landmark change. Not only that, but they go into detail on pregnancy as a factor that indicates it's appropriate to suspend a sentence, which means that when a woman is facing a prison term, the judge has the discretion to suspend it if the sentence is less than 2 years, which means that you don't go to prison, and unless you commit a further offence, you will stay out of prison. There's also measures in the sentencing guidelines now which take into account the case law that's been built. So in the last few years, because of the profile of this campaign and because of all of the amazing work that Anna's done speaking out about her experience in the press, it's attracted the attention of women and their families, women who have been pregnant in prison and have reached out to Level Up to say, I saw your campaign, is there anything that you can do about my daughter? And in several instances, we have matched them up with brilliant lawyers who've gone on to appeal those women's sentences, get them out of prison and create legal precedents. And so now those legal precedents are in the sentencing guidelines. So it's been this multi-layered strategy.
Wow.
Where it's just been, honestly, women helping women, helping women, helping women get them out and have the babies safely.
Well done.
Huge wins. Yeah, honestly, huge wins.
So we've gone from having no mention of pregnancy in sentencing guidelines. Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
Okay. To having considerations of pregnancy in sentencing. Would that, out of curiosity, do you think have made a difference to your experience, Anna?
Yeah, 100%. 100%, because that's what we're pushing for, is the community sentencing. So I think the thing is, and what the judges need to be made aware of, which is another thing me and Jane are going to try and do, is the fact that when you are sentencing these women, you're just like, a lot of them are just adding to their trauma and their cycle, and then you're putting these children in these unnecessary, unsafe environments. And I think there's a lot of people that will praise mother and baby units, but me personally, I still don't think the children should be there. They're not good, or they should. I don't think they should exist. I think it's much safer. And the government obviously like to waste money, because you're pouring all this money into this, and a lot, like I keep saying, like, a lot of these women, they're non-violent offenders. I don't even like calling them offenders, but their offences are non-violent, so they don't really pose a risk to the community. Like, there's no reason why you can't take these women, pick them up, and just put them in a community setting and let them do their sentence that way. There are other things that they can look at.
Yeah. You know what, let's talk about that, because we'll turn to the media now. And one of the media's key rebuttals to this issue, and indeed, one of society's key rebuttals to this issue has been, well, what if a pregnant person has done something really bad? Like, surely they should be in prison. And I'm sure there are some listeners even, who are listening to this conversation and thinking, well, if someone has done something really bad, why shouldn't they face justice just because they're pregnant? As an example of this, as a media rebuttal, we want to play a clip of you, Janie, on LBC, being interviewed by, or debating with, or being interrupted by, it's hard to say, Nick Ferrari.
Oh, Nick.
For those who don't know, Nick Ferrari is the presenter of LBC's breakfast show, and he's known for his conservative views.
They only go behind bars if it's a fairly major crime, Janie. You suggesting they don't go behind bars for that?
I'm sorry to correct you, but the majority of women are in prison. The most prevalent offence is shoplifting. Have you looked at the latest stats on actually what women are in prison for?
I haven't. No, I haven't. I've no idea. No.
You need to correct that. You really can't.
Well, it won't be. I assure you, it won't be the first. It won't be one case of shoplifting. It will be a pattern of repeat behaviour. It won't be they've nicked a few lamb chops. Let's be honest with each other.
It will be the reality that we're living in across.
No, it'll be the reality of a repeat offender. And I ask again, why should she not go to jail because she's a mother?
So we need to look at the reality of what prison creates. It creates.
They'll have probably done it about 20 times.
Look at the lens of punishment.
They should go behind bars.
Crime wholesale. We can look at diverting funding from prisons into communities so people get the support they need for poverty, trauma, drug use, mental health, domestic abuse. That is grounded in evidence.
But the same could be said for men. That's the point, isn't it? The same could be said for men. If they've had an abusive background, which is horrific for them. But that doesn't mean you don't go to jail if you're a repeat criminal, does it?
What I'm talking about is actually resourcing communities to address these drivers at the root where they are first a problem. Prison, by the time people are being sent to prison, you're just compounding the deprivation. We need to.
Let's all have a walk in the streets then, and there won't be a lamb chop to be found in Sainsbury's.
Can I just say,
please?
I found it so obscure because this was at like 7:50 a.m. and this man would not shut up about lamb chops. It was really bizarre.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my favourite part is when you say, I'm sorry to correct you, without a hint of being sorry.
I was not sorry.
And then you just hit him with the stats.
You didn't even let you talk.
On
course
what
he
women
didn't.
No, I mean, the interrupting is also next
Course he
level.
didn't.
I have to say, I think people won't even, because of the style of his interview, those stats didn't even get the moment to come through.
Right, well, let's do it now. So you mentioned there in that clip of the tiny part that we could hear you, shoplifting. So can you explain to us, what women are usually in prison for, and also how you tackle this question when it comes up?
So what prison represents in the public imagination, as opposed to what prison is in reality, are two vastly different things. And I think a key part of this campaign has been making that clearer and really breaking down the myths and the walls psychologically between what people think prison is for and who prison is for and who is actually in prison. Because the stats show year on year on year, the vast majority of women in prison are for short sentences. The last stats were 50% of women in prison are there for less than 6 months. And the most prevalent offence, predictably, is shop theft. And it doesn't take a genius to recognise that that is something that is environmentally created by the society that we are living in. And I think often, the criminal justice system blames individuals for the failures in our society to support people, to make sure that everyone can earn a decent living wage, to make sure that everybody has, safe and secure housing. And time on time again, the evidence has been there for 20 years now. So there was a landmark government report in 2007 called the Corsten Report, and it was off the back of a swathe of really harrowing suicides inside women's prisons. And the government looked at, what's going on inside our women's prisons and just found the same things that people see now, which is that the majority of women in prison are mothers. There is so much trauma and poverty and deprivation and, substance use and domestic abuse that are driving women into the criminal justice system. And ultimately, prison just compounds the deprivation. You know, in theory, when you send someone to prison, you remove their liberty for a set period of time and then they're released back out in the community. In practice, what happens is even if you're there for 2-3 months, you lose your home. If you have children and there's no family to take care of them, your children will go into care, sometimes irreversibly. If you had a job, that job is gone. And what happens is you find women then being released homeless, completely traumatized because their children have been removed from them, which is arguably the most severe punishment you could ever inflict on anyone. It's barbaric. You know, side note, not only is that awful for the mother, but also produces so much intergenerational trauma for children. And then when you look at the reality that women are going there for often crimes of survival in a society that is becoming increasingly difficult to survive, it's so clear that the fault lays with government. It's so clear that, you know, when we remove our welfare safety net, our criminal net expands because that's all that is left for people.
This is the vast majority of cases that you are talking about. Mm-hmm. Domestic abuse is a huge factor. Coercion, inequality, it compounds inequality. And most women have committed non-violent offences. However, your campaign is no births behind bars. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that lots of media make the case for, you know, non-violent manipulated domestic abuse victims, you know, shouldn't be in prison. I am curious, though, why you are also advocating for women who have committed serious crimes, as much of a minority as they are, and are pregnant. Do you believe that they should not be in prison while pregnant, and how do you make that case in the media?
It is a difficult line to take because when it comes to prison, everyone's first question is, well, what's she done? Well, why is she there? Well, you know, there's this immediate barrier because they don't want to have empathy, because criminalised women are seen as separate. It's like what Anna was saying about the use of the word offender. Like, there's so much dehumanising language that people set up. But ultimately, if we say that prison is high risk for some women, not others, we undermine our own argument. You just can't say that. The risks are universal to all women and their children. Ultimately, when it comes to pregnancy in prison and the risks, the damage that it does to children has to be considered. And I think even in the most extreme cases, which are so rare and few and far between, and I feel, you know, reluctant to have to address it, but you have to, because they're so not representative of the majority of women in prison. There are options for a sentence, for example, to be deferred so a woman can give birth safely. And that is something that has happened in the US. That's something that other countries do. It's not controversial. I think in particular, England has a very punitive criminal justice system. We have the highest incarceration rates in Europe. We have a tabloid press that is constantly goading the courts into giving out longer and more punitive sentences. But ultimately, I think the arguments around, women on short sentences shouldn't do this, or women for, non-violent things shouldn't do this, when actually some of the longest sentences are for non-violent crimes. There's no correlation. The sentencing system, once you get into the weeds of it, you'll find that the women who are serving 18-year sentences are there for Class A drugs imports, and often they've been trafficked. So we don't want to get into the weeds of criminal justice policy. We want to keep the focus on that bond between mother and baby, on reproductive justice, and on making sure that, even when you look at the stats, the vast majority of women, I'm talking like 75%, 3 in 4 women, are there for less than 4 years. Even if we can get them out, that's a massive improvement. The way our court system works is that a judge has to do a balancing exercise. If someone has committed murder, they are going to prison. That is a simple fact. But that is such a tiny minority, it should not determine the fate of the rest of the thousands of women who enter prison gates, who enter courtrooms every single year. And for too long, the argument has been, hypotheticals outweighing the lived realities of women in prison. We can talk about, pregnant murderers roaming in the streets, or we can talk about the fact that 3 babies have died inside custody in the last 5 years. And that is simply untenable. We have to stick with the material reality of women's experiences and keep them safe.
Thank you for addressing that.
Thank you. Anna, I wonder, what have your experiences been like speaking to the press on this issue?
I've had a mixed bag of experiences, to be honest. Obviously I do a lot of the work anonymous, and that's my choice because, you know, my son's still young. He doesn't really understand where he knows I went to prison, but he doesn't know he was born there. And that's obviously a conversation I have to have with him later. But, you know, I've had an experience where I asked to be anonymous. They was meant to blur my image, but they didn't. They put it out and somebody had recognised me. I had another experience where I did a radio interview and he started the interview with this. It was pre-recorded and then he started it with, which I didn't hear this bit until it went out, and he said, "Oh, I've asked Anna to disclose her crime and she's refused to." I was just like, I really don't get what the point was in that, because it's so irrelevant to the topic that we're talking about. It made no sense to me at all. And all he had said to me in the conversation before pressing record was, "Would you be happy to disclose your crime?" And I said exactly the same thing. I said my crime was non-violent and I really feel like it's irrelevant to the topic. And he was like, okay. And then he started the interview with that. So I felt a bit blindsided by that. But apart from that, people have been quite positive. I think that a lot of the shock was as well, I think people never really understood that pregnant women were sent to prison and it was overlooked. And because the pregnant women in prison is such a minority that it does just get overlooked. And it's like, unless you have a personal experience with somebody that's been in there, a lot of people just think that it doesn't happen, but it does.
I wonder, Janie, when do you think the media started taking notice of this issue? Was there a surge in coverage at any point? Or was it a bit of a slow burn? Or was there a turning point?
We have forced them to take notice of this. Obviously, there have been key junctures, for example, when the prison ombudsman issued the report, when there was an inquest into one of the baby's deaths, when kind of legal processes have caught the media attention and kind of been on the weekly news cycle. But repeatedly over the last few years, Level Up has found the hooks and made the hooks. So what we've done is, submitted FOI requests to find out the rates of stillbirths and premature births and the rates of gestational diabetes. Most recently, we found that pregnant women in prison are 3 times more likely to suffer gestational diabetes, and obviously they do not get the support that they need.
FOI is freedom of information.
Yeah. And, we've used that data to get journalists to take interest, because obviously journalists want something that's new, that's hooked to something. So we'll either get the stats or we'll do mother and baby protests around Mother's Day. So we have mother and baby protests coming up outside the Ministry of Justice on Friday, the 28th of March. It's our 4th Mother's Day mum and baby protest. And obviously they're very cute, but they are a very carefully curated media strategy, because when you put lots of very cute mums and babies outside the Ministry of Justice, it's like catnip for journalists, because they are adorable. They don't look like any protest you've ever seen. We're just there with a parachute and a yellow banner playing reggae nursery rhymes. And then journalists come, take pictures, report on it. And obviously every time they report on a mum and baby protest outside the MOJ, they go to the MOJ for right of reply and they say, hey, all these protesters are saying that you shouldn't be putting pregnant women in prison. And so the Ministry of Justice Media Office then have to come out with a line that obviously goes into their clippings and their meetings every single week. And for the last 4 years, I think this will be our 12th mum and baby protest. We've done them outside the prisons where babies died. We've done them outside the Royal Courts of Justice. We've done them outside the Ministry of Justice. And every time we do one, we get media attention. Every time we get media attention, there has to be a right of reply. There's been a steady drip feed, both in the public, because it's the public who are reading the papers and watching coverage of the protests on Channel 4, and then also behind the scenes to stakeholders, so they can see that there is public interest and huge public sympathy. We commissioned polling that found the majority of people do not want to see pregnant women or mothers in prison where a community alternative is available. Now that's hugely persuasive to a judiciary who are frankly scared of public opinion because of the way the media has produced so much moral panic around crime.
Really interesting to hear the behind the scenes of, making the news media listen to you. That's really helpful. Thank you. But also, it's not just the news media. It's also pop culture. And earlier this year, EastEnders ran a storyline which featured a pregnant character, the iconic Sonia Fowler,
Here we go.
in prison. Now, okay, as someone who's watched EastEnders since they were 10 years old, I'll just give everyone like a little rundown of the storyline, what happened. Okay, so Reese and Sonia were a couple. They wanted to have a baby, but they needed to go through the IVF route. After stealing his comatose ex-wife's money to pay for the IVF, Reese gets further and further into debt. So, like the sneaky psychopath he is, he ends up killing his comatose ex-wife to get the life insurance. However, turns out Sonia's DNA is on the pillow used to kill his ex-wife because she visited her earlier that day because she's like a lovely person. And then Sonia gets framed and goes to prison while pregnant. Could happen to anyone. Very realistic stuff. Don't worry, guys. Sonia is now out of prison, and Reese got killed by a bathtub on the live 40th anniversary episode.
Really had that coming.
That's justice.
Yeah. So, you know, can happen to anyone.
Oh my God,
Anyway.
I'm missing out, not watching.
Yeah.
I know. I
don't
just
watch it
love
either.
any opportunity to talk about TV. Okay. When Sonia was in prison on the show, there were some very powerful scenes when, for example, her family came to visit her in prison and she talked about what she was going through. First of all, Anna, how did it feel to watch that or to see that?
I'll be honest, I didn't watch. I'm not an EastEnders fan, but obviously I have read things about it, and I think my main thing was it's a lovely storyline to bring attention to the situation, but why did they have to put her in for murder? You know, like it's like they've gone for a violent offence, and it's like it doesn't depict the true situation that we're trying to talk about. So I'm like, it undermines it because there's very few women in prison for murder across the whole estate, not even pregnant women.
Okay, that's so interesting. Yeah, obviously, you know, right of reply, she was innocent. But, you know. But Janie, you know, Sonia actually quoted some level up statistics on the show that is watched by millions of people. I mean, that's got to be a win, right?
Huge win. And I think also, obviously, when you asked me the question before about like the news media, that's been one facet of our campaign. But another key part of this campaign over the last 5 years has been more in the like magazines and features space. And that's where really the hearts and minds work has been done. And I mean, I've lost track of the number of interviews that you've given to Cosmopolitan, Glamour, Stylist, Women's Health, Metro. You know, these are the cultural spaces where public opinion gets formed. And I think the power of women's stories being just repeated again and again, because any woman reading them, even if you haven't had experience of the prison system, everybody has some relationship to pregnancy, to motherhood, to parenthood, to children, and it's that universal value that really connects people. And I think that has been what has contributed to the EastEnders storyline. It's not necessarily been the stats. Of course, the stats have been important, but it's the way that those stats have then been grounded in so much empathy and compassion and solidarity for women's experiences. That has landed up, you know, with EastEnders portraying this in a very careful and sensitive way, barring the fact that they used murder, because I agree that was completely... Yeah. It's just not representative. But then, are the soaps... that really...
killed by a bathtub, you know?
Are the soaps that exactly? But I think what was really powerful was the way that, you know, that stat came up because Sonia was terrified of giving birth in prison, and that has only come about because of stories like Anna's again and again featuring in the media, and people recognizing that it is a reality for so many pregnant women inside the prison system, that they are terrified of giving birth inside prison, and the reality that babies have died.
I have no doubt that Anna's testimony and the testimonies of all other women brave enough to share this hellish experiences has changed minds.
Rihanna Cleary, the mum whose baby died at Bronzefield, after the inquest into her baby's death, at the end of it, she went on Channel 4 and she gave a statement. And in her statement, she just said, the way prisons are run is about power and control. They will never be caring places. And I just thought that sums it up really. Like, the way that prisons, the very design of a prison just means it will not be a caring place. And we need to stop entertaining the delusion that a prison could ever be safe for anyone, let alone a pregnant woman.